Imagine working in a tunnel 30 feet underground when a fire breaks out. It stands between you and the only route to safety. You try to retreat in the other direction, but you can't get more than 100 meters away before you come to a dead end. First, the tunnel fills with smoke and noxious gases, and then it begins to collapse. And there is still no way out. This was the nightmare faced by 5 Toronto workers. It became known as the Hoggs Hollow Disaster, and the worst thing may be that it didn't have to happen. Neglect and indifference from the men in charge of the project had led to this tragedy, but it would fuel a drive for worker safety that created many of the workplace rights that we have today.
Where is this guy? Oh. Hello?
Hello? Hello?
Buddy, good to hear from you today. So, we're talking about the Hoggs Hollow Disaster, and we might as well just get into it right now. Let's go. Come on, you kick us off. Let's go.
I'm Adam Weiser.
And I'm Grayson Miller.
And this is Muddy York.
Hoggs Hollow is a neighborhood in North York, southeast of Yonge and York Mills. The first part of the name comes from the Hogg family, who operated a distillery and grist mill in the area. The second part comes from the narrow valley or hollow carved by a branch of the Don River. If you've driven up Yonge Street, Hoggs Hollow is the dip between Lawrence and Shepherd. Today, it's one of the richest neighborhoods in Toronto. In 1960, it was at the edge of suburban development.
On the evening of March 17th, 12 men were working overtime, welding steel plating inside of a tunnel that ran underneath the Don River. The tunnel had a diameter of less than 2 meters, with a water main running through it, so moving around wouldn't have been easy. The soft earth around the tunnel meant that compressed air had to be pumped in to prevent cave-ins. In fact, the pressure in the tunnel was so high that workers had to use a decompression chamber before leaving to prevent an awful condition called the bends. The tunnel was designed to connect a pumping station on Wilson with a water distribution network 6 miles away at York Mills and Victoria Park. It had been scheduled for completion a year earlier, but the contractor had submitted an unrealistically low bid and went broke. The Guarantee Company of North America had issued a bond for project, meaning they would have to make a payout if it wasn't completed. They didn't want to do that, so they took over the project. Guarantee didn't know much about construction, and they didn't care. They just wanted to finish the project as quickly and as cheaply as possible. The underground workers on the project had no fire extinguishers, no breathing equipment, no hard hats, and no safety shoes. The tunnel was poorly lit, and a phone within the tunnel had been removed for repairs. The only way for workers to report a problem was to use a switch attached to a red light above ground. As one of the workers said, that job they were on was a haywire job. The company did not know enough about construction. They wanted to make money. Workers had some workplace protections in the old city of Toronto, but very few in the suburbs. A representative from Guarantee overruled the construction supervisor when he expressed concern, and several foremen were fired when they complained about unsafe work conditions.
A little before 6 p.m., one of the electric cables powering the welders caught fire. It may have overheated, or it may have been ignited by a spark. The high air pressure within the tunnel created an oxygen-rich environment that produced a flash fire. The blaze was also fueled by oil residue from a poorly serviced air compressor. Half of the men fled east and surfaced at York Mills. The men on the surface tried to open a valve to clear the smoke from the tunnel, but found that it was stuck. When the fire department arrived, they were instructed to wait at least 30 minutes before using water inside the tunnel, in the hope that the blaze might extinguish itself. Otherwise, the tunnel might collapse from the force of the water. Underground, 4 of the men fled west to get away from the fire and wound up trapped against a concrete bulkhead 100 meters away. They had no breathing equipment and no way to communicate with the surface. Walter Andruschuk tried to escape with one of his colleagues. The smoke was awful, and then the water hit us. It came up to our knees. I was scared, but I knew they would come and get us out. But the heat was draining our energy. There was a glimmer of hope. I could see a light from the shaft, and I just knew we would be all right. I started back toward the shaft. The other 5 wouldn't come with me. They were screaming and down on their knees praying. I grabbed Pasquale Allegreza by the shirt and started dragging him along the pipe. There was no room to carry him, and I couldn't fight the smoke any longer. I had to let go of Pasquale. Another few feet, and I had to put my face down on the pipe. I was sleepy, and then I guess I passed out. Just before I passed out, I was afraid for the first time that I would not get out.
At some point, somebody made the fateful decision to turn off the air compressor. This was meant to deprive the fire of oxygen, but the lack of pressure meant that the water and silt now began to fill the tunnel, piling up near the bulkhead where 4 of the workers would be found. Later investigations would reveal that some of them had water and silt in their lungs. Chaos reigned above ground as firefighters, police officers, family members, and other workers tried to figure out what to do. Rescue efforts on the surface were slowed by the absence of an emergency plan. Several attempts were made to rescue the trapped men, but the rescuers lacked any special equipment. One of them told the Globe, "It was hotter than hell down there. Going was rough. I had to crawl on my hands and knees. There wasn't much room to move. Sand, water everywhere, and smoke. It took me about 5 minutes to reach them. By that time, my eyes were running from the smoke. My head was dizzy. It kept turning around and around. Then I could see them lying there. They were dead. I could tell they were dead. I could feel it. I tried to lift one, I don't know who. There wasn't enough room to get a grip and pull him. If there were 2 of us, we could have done it. But I was all alone on that side of the pipe. It was no use. The smoke was killing me. I had to get back. When I got out, I told the boss they were in there. He started to cry. I begged him to let me go back in, but he sent me to the hospital." Around 9 p.m., one of the firefighters found Walter Andruschuk unconscious and managed to drag him to the surface, but he would be the only survivor among the men who had been trapped underground. By midnight, the fire was out of the tunnel and had been repressurized. Pasquale Allegreza's body was discovered at 2 a.m., but the other bodies were buried in water and silt. It would take days to pump out the tunnel and recover the other 4 bodies.
We've already mentioned Pasquale Allegreza. The other 4 victims were Giovanni Cariglio, Giovanni Fusillo, and 2 brothers, Alessandro and Guido Mantella. You may have noticed that all of these names are Italian. Today, Italians are seen as an integral part of Toronto. In 1960, they were outsiders, foreign, poor, and Catholic. Construction companies liked hiring Italians for manual labor because they were often the sole means of support for their families and could be coerced with empty threats of deportation. As one worker said, it was a jungle in the residential field, with contractors not paying you, and they would disappear in the middle of the night. There were no minimum wages and no laws. I earned 75 cents an hour and barely had 30 minutes for lunch, just enough time to swallow a sandwich and return to the scaffold. Immediately following the tragedy, Provincial Labor Minister Charles Daly had enraged the Italian community by saying that all regulations had been followed on site, which was manifestly untrue. Other efforts to sweep the incident under the rug would fail, largely due to the work of a journalist named Frank Drea. Drea worked for the Toronto Telegram, which was a lot like the Sun. It was conservative, but it was also a populist working-class paper. Drea had been reporting on the construction industry for some time, and he had contacts throughout companies, unions, and government. He wrote dramatic stories about the mistreatment of tradesmen and laborers. When an editor asked him to write a front-page story about these issues in the aftermath of the disaster, the Telegram's headline blared, "Slave Immigrants." The story goes that Drea and his editor were called into the publisher's office. He thought he was about to be fired. Instead, the publisher told him, "Tremendous. I want you in the paper every day with it. I want this covered from start to finish."
A coroner's inquest had been called the day after the disaster. However, the Telegram ensured that the investigation remained in the spotlight. The official cause of death was listed as acute carbon monoxide poisoning and suffocation due to the inhalation of smoke, sand, and water. However, the hearings also exposed many of the abuses in the construction industry, including workers who were denied lunch breaks, forced to do unpaid overtime, and paid with checks that frequently bounced. Contractors would sometimes keep two sets of books, one showing the correct numbers of hours worked by an employee and the actual rate that they were paid per hour, and a second in which the number of hours worked was logged by dividing a worker's gross wages by the official rate of pay. The report said that the deaths were the inevitable result of the failure to implement and enforce regulations, and cited the callous attitude of management towards worker safety. Conclusions: they did not recommend charges against specific people because they said the problems were too systemic. Public outcry led the premier to call for a royal commission on industrial safety. After 17 hearings, 118 witnesses, and 160 exhibitions, the commission released its report. It called for regulatory changes that were specific to the disaster, like ensuring that police and firefighters were trained in tunnel rescue work and that workers were advised of the hazards of construction with compressed air. However, it also made broad recommendations designed to improve workers' safety, like replacing the Building Trades Protection Act, which had been passed in 1911, ensuring that new legislation clearly assigned responsibility for enforcement to the Department of Labor, and creating harsher penalties for workplace safety violations. In 1964, the province passed the Industrial Safety Act. 3 years later, this legislation would become the basis for the Canada Labour Code.
While the commission was doing its work, the Hoggs Hollow disaster provided the impetus for a major unionization drive among workers in the construction industry. Until then, unionization was concentrated in specialist trades, dominated by Canadian-born workers. A coalition of unions called the Brandon Group organized an illegal strike in 1960 that led hundreds of contractors to agree to wage increases, a 40-hour work week, 45 for laborers, vacation pay, and union recognition. A second strike, organized the following year, was larger and more violent. In response, the premier offered to create a temporary arbitration board, appoint more government inspectors, and establish another royal commission to examine labor management relations in the construction industry. One of the strike leaders initially agreed to these terms in a meeting with the premier, but later changed his mind. After a series of violent incidents began eroding public support for the workers, union leaders wound up ending the strike on roughly the same terms that they had been initially offered. The Hoggs Hollow disaster certainly didn't stop workplace exploitation, but it established some of the worker protections that we take for granted today, things like safety equipment and warnings about hazardous materials.
In 2000, a memorial plaque was installed at the site of the incidents. Coastie Immigration Services also commissioned an artist to create a memorial quilt called Breaking Ground, depicting the 5 men in the tunnel. After initially being displayed at City Hall, the quilt would be permanently installed at York Mill Station on the 50th anniversary of the disaster. At that event, Toronto and York Region Labour Council President John Cartwright said, Hoggs Hollow changed forever the relationship of immigrants to the city of Toronto. Wave after wave of immigrants that subsequently came to the city all owe a debt of gratitude to those 5 men. Their sacrifice and their courage of the Italian community, which demanded a new deal for immigrants in the city.
Well, guys, that's the episode. Thank you so much for listening to us. If you want to reach out, make sure you check out our newest platforms. We're on YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram at Muddy York Podcast, or you can shoot us an email, muddy_york@outlook.com. Thank you. We've had some people actually write in, and it's really great, and we're just going to read some of the messages today. We've got a great shout out from a Mr. Steve Rhythm, and he just says that he's been living in New York City and is moving back to the city. And he says, bro, love the podcast. I'm moving back to Toronto from NYC and learning so much from you. So guys, keep reaching out. We will talk about it on the podcast. Thank you so much. Good listening to you. Welcome back to Toronto, Stephen. We also got a lovely message from a Miss Brond Wiles, who sent us the message that she's been listening in her son's car when he's driving me, and she grew up in Toronto's East End, then moved to the Beaches and lived at Fallingbrook Road, right across from the dance pavilion. And she would sit, her bedroom was right on Queen Street, and this is the late 1940s, and she would watch people coming and going from the dance hall. And what a great story that was. We love hearing from people, especially if you've been living in the city for 70 plus years. We'd love to hear from you. What an amazing story. Thank you so much for writing in.